Hello.
Hello.
How are we all doing?
We're doing it.
Good?
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
That's the stuff. All right. Okay, so welcome to our talk. Today we're going to talk about the Lifecycle of LiveOps from MVP to global. So my name's Sean. I'm the LiveOps Director in Leamington.
And I'm Laine. I'm the LiveOps Director in Sheffield. So in this session, we are not going to be talking about building games. We're not going to be talking about production of games. Y'all know how to build games. You know how to build great games. Y'all know how to build great production teams. We're here to talk about things you may not know about. During the road to releasing a live title, what are the things you actually need to be considering? What do you need to be building and architecting that you may not have thought about before if this is your first rodeo building a game that's going to live for a long time?
Yeah, so I think, as I said, so in this session we'll be looking at all those elements that are needed, looking at the tech, looking at the team, looking at kind of the attitude that you want to be taking when going to live service. And just to reiterate, we're not going to be telling you how to make a game, you know how to do that. It really is just kind of a helicopter view from kind of the start through to delivery of the areas that you might not be perhaps familiar with or perhaps not have experience with.
And everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face. This is LiveOps in general. We can build the greatest thing in the world, and then we throw it in front of players. They zig when they're meant to zag, and everything gets thrown out. This is the fun and chaos of LiveOps that we like.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, so just a quick overview. So we're going to go over pre-production, then production through an MVP. Early access, we'll touch on that a little. And then finally kind of tuning, experimentation, and your kind of path to global launch. So, going into pre-production.
Yeah, so in terms of pre-production, it's really, really critical with a live title that you're thinking about the liveness of your title from the get-go. You don't get to bolt it on later. You're not going to make a great game that evolves over time by doing that. So during the pre-production phase, we're really talking about the pillars of the game, what that live vision is, who we're making the game for, the market research, the motivations of those players, what they're into and what they're not, as well as some of the game design elements like the micro, the macro, and the meta gameplay, and how we're going to start architecting the game at this early stage. So in terms, did anyone see Damien's awesome talk a few minutes ago? Excellent, excellent. We're going to be touching a little bit on that. If you didn't get the chance to check out his talk when it comes up on the Vault, please do, because it was really, really good. But in terms of our game pillars, gameplay is core. If you don't have a great game, you are not going to get anywhere. Maybe there's an outlier here or there we could all point to, but a great live title has to be a great game from the ground up. It has to be fun every second. It has to be a game you're proud of making and proud of playing. In addition to the gameplay, you also want to think about the expression of players. How do they express themselves, if that's communication, if that's customization? How do they progress? How do they get better at something, evolve to meet a challenge, or gain social status, gain leaderboard positions? And then how do we operate the game? These are what we would consider the pillars for your live service that you do want to be considering in that early pre-production stage.
Yeah. And obviously when kind of putting together and thinking about the game you're making, you really want to spend some time looking at market research. You know, it's a constantly evolving landscape. You know, live services, didn't exist 20 years ago, and it's carved its way on mobile. And of course, you've got long-standing games, obviously World of Warcraft coming into 20 years now.
Year 19 right 19,
now.
Yeah.
So the market is constantly changing. Season pass and battle pass, that's a relatively new concept, and even so, it's almost long in the tooth already at this point. So take the time to understand the market, analyze the different type of things your competitors or comparators are doing. Like Damien gave a great example in his talk about looking at those, looking at Genshin Impact, looking at Clash of Clans and Clash Royale. All of these things have, they have well established what works and what doesn't, but also it gives you the opportunity to understand, where players are going, what they're playing, why they're engaged in it, and start to think about how you can start to thread that into your own title.
Yeah, and on that, if you've got a product manager on your team, would highly recommend that we have a product manager on any live service title. This is where the product manager is absolutely earning their salt early in pre-production, doing that research, understanding the player, bringing that back to the game team, especially the design team, so you can architect something great. In terms of those player motivations, we are thinking about their intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. they want to play to have fun, sure, but are they building, or are they playing to socialize? Are they playing to gather? Are they competitors? Are they just jerks? Are we making a game for jerks? I've worked on a game for jerks. It was a racing game with betting. It was a really fun game to work on, but we knew who our players were, and that's why it was fun. And do those features that we've got in the game, the gameplay elements, and the actual pillars match what we think about players? And pro tip, this is something we're going to test later on. A lot of the things we do with a live title is making assumptions that we test later.
Yeah.
So in terms of I say in terms too much, I'm sorry, but there's what we consider the micro, the macro, and the meta. Micro being the minute-to-minute, second-to-second gameplay. This is the core of your game. Everything has to be awesome there. It should be really fun. You've also got the macro, which is that more long-term strategy, but still thinking about day-to-day. How do you get better at fighting? How do you figure out the best build for this week? As well as the meta, which is much more longer term. It could be week to week, month to month, year to year. But that is an overall evolution. It's an overall change in the game. It's these social interactions that players do. It's what you do thinking about the game when you're not inside the game. Overwatch is a really good example of this, where they've got new characters coming in, they've got to rebalance, they've got to nerf, they change some of the maps. You can play all the time. If you play all the time, you're going to get better at the meta. But if you play once every few months, you're not really going to understand what's going on there. So that's kind of that long-term progression we want to be thinking about pretty early on. And all three are really of equal importance.
Yeah. Now, another thing, obviously, which is kind of really important, particularly in that pre-production phase, is thinking about the architecture that you need to support the game. You know, obviously, you're familiar with building a game, working in engine, probably running up servers, you know, things like multiplayer, but there's a whole host of other things that kind of run parallel that help you kind of deliver a live service title, which you might not have covered. You know, the analytics back end is probably the first and foremost thing that you want to be putting in from day one, because the earlier you get that in, not only obviously do you have the chance to make it more robust for when it goes out to live, but it also gives you the ability during pre-production and production to actively analyze and look at what's happening in your game, to be able to see at a granular level the types of things that you want to be able to optimize and tweak about the gameplay, about the progression, about the meta, and obviously, you know, additional systems, which I'll talk about later, things like experimentation, personalization, all of these kinds of tools, game management. You know, this is a live title. You're going to want to be able to update the thing without having to constantly barrel onto your back-end programs and say, hey, we want to put a new thing out into the game. Can you spend the next 3 weeks doing that? At the pre-production phase, that's when you want to be thinking about those types of services. How can your product manager be able to go in and add new content, add new packs, you know, modify a season pass, change what's on the front end? All of these things are additional areas which you perhaps might not have covered, but are fundamental for being able to effectively manage a live service. It enables your product team, it enables your design team to be able to kind of test, iterate, and deliver content when they need to, at the time they need to.
Right, and you don't need to build all those things in pre-production either, but you should have a deliverable of defining them.
Yeah.
Know what your server stack is going to look like, know what your architecture for telemetry is going to be, and have a plan for how you're going to be updating, you know, if it's over the air or if it's client. We like avoiding client updates because they're long and expensive.
Yeah.
So now we'll go into the actual production stage. Everyone loves production. When we get out of pre-production, we get to build the damn thing. Awesome. So who do we need is something that I think is actually really important to think about. Who should be on that game team when you're getting into production? And what I would highlight here is the community development, community management, the economy and systems design, your data and experimentation folks, so data science plus data engineering, and building in levers and tooling that are actually accessible, meaning that data is exposed, it can be changed on the fly. Let's say we have a fire rate on a gun of 30 bullets per second. I don't know anything about guns. That sounds right. And we need to change that later on, make sure that data is exposed.
Yeah.
And during this stage, we're also validating constantly, because live games tend to be data driven. We should be building data in with features, but also testing against that data and using that data to validate if the game is fun or not. Stampede Racing Rail, I think, did a really good job of showing this during their development, you know, using heat maps to find a lot, to really tune the fun of the game.
Yeah. Yeah, obviously community is one thing which and I'd say actually our senior community manager Chris is here. Shout out to him, he's phenomenal. But it's really important, particularly for live service, because the community, and Damien really touched on this quite well, was that how fundamental that kind of social aspect, those social levers are to the game. And community itself is something where you really kind of get into that space. It's not a marketing tool. It's not something that sits off elsewhere in a third party. It is part of the development team. They're giving you, where the data gives you that quantitative data, that quantitative analysis about what's happening in the game. The community is that qualitative analysis. They are the voice of the dev team out to the community, but they're also the voice of the community back into the dev team. And it's fundamental. The earlier you can get a community manager on, ideally early in pre-production or production, you're going to have all the levers and all the tooling ready for when you go out to build out a really strong player base.
And for economy, all of these live service games that we really look at models, things like Clash Royale, things like Overwatch, things like Destiny, they're very systems driven. There tend to be large systems of content and progression, as well as an economy that goes with that. So having a really strong systems designer or an economy designer, super critical going in. It should begin in production. You want to be modeling, especially if you're going to have any in-game economies, things like soft currencies, hard currencies. You want to be modeling that early on, because those models need to change often. And as you make gameplay design decisions, you're going to want to change those models, and that reduces your risk quite a bit if you know what you're actually getting into. Understanding what adding another world might do to that economy. Are we making inflation or deflation? Because those are things that we control. And those systems really bring you to the point of getting players engaged with the game, coming back to the game. If you've got players coming back to the game over and over again, you've won their time. That's amazing. You can always figure out how to monetize later. Having great content, things people want to buy, that gets you 90% of the way there. But if you don't have the engagement retention, everything is going away. It's falling through holes in a bucket. You don't want that.
Yeah. So, as we touched on, obviously data experimentation are fundamental in terms of live service. You can theoretically get away with them, with not having them when you're looking at certain products, which you release, box products. But for live service, it's fundamentally your finger on the pulse to be able to tell you what is happening in your game, and ideally every aspect of your game, how players are progressing, where are they, dropping off. The biggest kind of area you look at, particularly in early onboarding, is the funnel. You've got the FTUE, your first time user experience. You will lose 40% of your players in the space of the first 20 minutes. And, the smallest thing can cause a 5% drop, which might not seem much, but 5% over 10 million users suddenly is quite a large amount. And having kind of the tooling in place so that you can analyse that, you can dive into it, you can combine the qualitative analysis from your community team, from your product managers, from your designers, and back that up with a kind of deep and kind of statistical analysis about where precisely people are dropping off, or what they are enjoying, what they are not enjoying, is going to really effectively give you the ability to elevate your game, give you the tooling. It's that string on the bow that further reinforces the knowledge of the designer, the knowledge of the product manager.
Yeah, and you need to make sure that there are tools supporting that. So I've said the word levers a lot of times. I'll say it again. Levers and levers, both super important here. You want the data exposed. You want it to be malleable. You want to be able to change after the fact. You also want to be really planning for your updates now. And in the production phase, this is when you're going to be starting to build out your content roadmap. Look at when you're doing updates, and are they coming over the air? Are they client? You can still have a client update. It's all right. You will need to at some point, but the more you can do over the air or just downloading a package, the better off you're going to be. It's going to give you flexibility and the ability to react quickly, which is what you want. Not just if you've got a bug, but if there's a hot new meme that you could actually be playing with by making, a meme character. Awesome. Do that. You're going to have fun. Your ideal state for a gas title is that anything in the game that's content or event related, you want a new season, that can all be done and built, set up, and turned on or off without a coder. So building the tools and building the infrastructure is key here, so that your product manager can do that and let your coders work on code, which is a lot more interesting than having to push a update. The other thing I would really recommend is if you've got major game features, things like PvE and PvP, be able to have kill switches on them, so if something has gone horribly wrong, you can turn something off. Once your community manager has flagged that, hey, everyone's exploiting this PvE feature, let's just say we turn the PvE dungeon off.
Yeah, I think it's a pertinent point about the updates as well. And the one thing I'd kind of point out as well is, there is a certain velocity of client updates that you can shoulder. You will have to do updates, but there is a point where if the more frequently you do them, you will cause churn. People leave your game when you update it, and if you're doing it, say, once every 3 months, it's a very small number. But if you get to a point where a player's picking up the game, and every time they open the game, there's another update coming down, that number will start to climb quite rapidly. So considering how you can get content to players, and also just really hold back that kind of update, so that client updates ideally are probably once a season. You will have
maximum
bug fixes, you will have potentially things you want to put out in between that, and you want to be able to plan for that as well. But yeah, the more stuff that you can deliver, remotely over the air, via a CDN, via kind of some sort of back-end server, and again, the front end to be able to support the team to be able to manage that, it gives you another lever that's just going to reduce friction for the player.
So one of the funny things is we spend a lot of time talking about front end. In live games, we build a lot of UI. We tend to build a lot of UI that players will see maybe once in 1,000 sessions, because it's the thing that comes up saying, the server's down for regular maintenance, we'll be back in 2 hours.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
And just want to touch on the constant validation again. We've been building everything with data, so really start using that early on. If you're building a feature, the data, the telemetry for it, if that's a new event or if it's a new parameter, whatever it may be, that should be part of your acceptance criteria. When QA tests it, they should be testing the data as well. And this can really just work well with your design team, being able to put, a heat map to something, to put charts to something, to understand what our decisions as designers, as engineers, is actually having on the gameplay. And as we're getting into testing, say any kind of user testing, even friends and family, or a closed test in the office, getting that data is really going to help you make more informed decisions and get out of just the heat of the moment style of working. Yeah, I think as we mentioned, obviously, on Stampede, Racing Royale, wishlisted. We had data in pretty much from day one, and it's enabled us to observe and see things that we just wouldn't have been able to see otherwise from like an anecdotal standpoint. One thing we picked up quite early on was that the power-ups that we originally had an unintended bias favouring skilled players. Skilled players would pull away from the pack, and the pack would just self-manage itself. And the only reason we were really able to identify that was through the data. We were able to see, literally, the players in the mid were just shooting each other constantly, and the good players then were just getting away from them. And the result was the team were able to go out and rebalance the power-ups, redistribute how they're passed out, and also look at new types of power-ups just to kind of get a better gameplay experience. Sounds like F1.
Yeah. Yeah. So early access. Obviously we won't spend too long on this because this is relative. You might not go into the early access soft launch. For those that aren't familiar, soft launch is something we very commonly do on mobile, which is where we release in a territory, just a single territory. We don't announce it. We don't go public with it. It goes out to somewhere like Vietnam or the Philippines, somewhere where the player behaviours are somewhat similar to the Western market, but it's not going to get widespread traction. So you can kind of operate in that safe little sandbox. And obviously, early access is it's a Steam specific thing. But again, that concept where you're going out with, you still have to deliver a full game, but there is an acceptance, and as long as you communicate it well, that more is coming, that this is an early testing phase where we can kind of optimize, add new content, and ideally shape the game around what the community kind of feeds into us. But fundamentally, the thing you're looking to get from those is, it's an opportunity to test some of your hypothesis. It's an opportunity to put the game out, get some real players who aren't devs who've been looking at the thing for the last 3 years, and actually see how they are playing. Is your ideas about how people will play, what they will enjoy, how they will progress through the game, the things that they're interested in, is that true? Turns out they're going to be interested in something completely different, and they play it completely differently to the way you thought. The point being there, during that period, you can observe that and feed back in. Do you want to perhaps course correct the player into a specific type of loop, or do you want to modify how the game is playing to better suit the way the people are playing that game?
Yeah, and your early access or that soft launch version, it doesn't need to be the full game. You don't need all of the game modes and all of the content. If you've got a short-term window that you're trying to test in, say 30, 60 days, have 30 or 60 days of content. That's okay. That said, it doesn't get to be an unpolished, buggy mess. It should be polished. It should be a good product. If you want to get out of early access, players will have an expectation of bugs. That's okay, but it should be a robust title that we are happy to have a Sumo logo on. So during this time, it really does allow us to just optimize that design, validate the questions like Sean mentioned, but also to start testing things. Test the engagement, test the retention, test the community feedback, and then start understanding what content players are interested in or not. I've seen teams try to come out with a huge monetization strategy very early on before they understand how players are actually engaging with the game. I think that's a huge mistake and waste of resource. Have items for players to buy, but have a lot of different ones rather than going deep on any one category. You've got like skins and weapons and hats and all these things. Don't build 5,000 hats and 5,000 skins. Build like 5 of each and just see what players are actually into, what style they like. This is also your opportunity to really start building that community, developing the community, doing this back and forth with the dev team to the players and vice versa. And start growing that community, growing those events, and understanding, again, what events are popular. Where are players actually playing your game? Are they in the US or are they in Brazil? Because you're going to want to give different types of events and different community features for those players. You won't know it until you launch. You can try to market research your way into that, but it's not going to work until you've got an actual game with players with their hands on the sticks.
Yeah. So a couple of key considerations. One, when you go out into early access or soft launch, your work velocity will significantly reduce. If you're making, if you're consider your velocity 100, it's never really 100, but when the moment you go into early access, 30% is what you're going to be able to deliver, best case scenario, because you're going to have a variety of teams, you're going to have bug fixing teams, you're going to have content teams, management teams, feature teams working on, things for 3 months, 6 months, 12 months down the road. So plan for that, plan for a much lower velocity once you go out into early access, soft launch or whatever. I think as Laine said there, you don't need every feature, theoretically, if you put the game out, you don't need a day 30 feature until 30 days after your game goes out. That's not to say you don't want to release with everything, of course, but you have time. If certain features are targeted towards a longer term point in the window, whether it's, let's say a progression system that's really kind of diving into people that are going to be 90 days into the game, you can put that out in season 2 then, because no one's ever going to touch it in the first season of the game. And then finally, quickly understand your baseline KPIs. This is something you want to have had in place going into early access or soft launch, but you really want to use that period. What is your day one retention, and what is contributing to that? Why are so many people either returning or leaving on day one? What is driving monetization? What is that upsell funnel? What's your attach rate? How many people? Why are people playing for 20 or 30 minutes a day? And is that kind of on par with what you want to be able to achieve? The more you understand that, of course, you're going to be able to help feed into, again, your design in terms of your management, what you're optimizing, the content you're prioritizing, the features you're adding over time. All of this is just additional levers, which again, I keep saying levers now, which are going to feed into help understanding, giving you the best possible chance to have a successful game. So, experimentation. So we've got a whole section on this, and I'll go over. I'm going to have to go quite quick. I realise we've got 23 minutes.
Oh, we've got 7 minutes left.
Yeah, we've got 7. Yeah. So experimentation. That is a term I tend to use rather than A/B testing, which is perhaps what you're more familiar with. And the reason is experimentation covers a wide range of types of tests. The important thing, though, when running tests in games is you want to form a hypothesis. You're not going in and just doing a scatterdash approach of throwing ideas at the wall and seeing what sticks. There is a type of test that covers that as well, but we won't go into that one. What you are fundamentally able to do with experimentation is take an idea, test it on a small segment of users, and validate whether it's going to work. The real benefit there, and the kind of the secret sauce is, you're able to run multiple experiments, ideally quite quickly, and you can in a short space of time, put a lot of different experiences in front of a lot of different players and learn from that, see how they're reacting to that, and then deliver that out as improvements that you're going to roll out into the game. The important thing about experimentation, and this is a really one, is it reduces risk. You think about any update you make into a game, whether it be a balancing update, anyone who saw Damien's talk earlier when he was talking about the purpling of the bubble, that could have all, these things can be avoided if you do experimentation. You can take an idea, put it out just to 5,000 people, doesn't even 200 players, see how they play. Perhaps their retention drops or maybe it goes up, but it gives you a small sandbox that isn't going to cannibalise the experience for the wider player base. They're going to be able to see what's happening in the game, understand what's happening, and then roll that out into the kind of the wider player base. So in terms of a quick primer, again, I'm going to have to kind of rattle through this a little bit. I won't go all of them, but there's fundamentally 3 primary types of experiment. That's a split test, randomized control trial, and a digital field experiment. I won't go over all of them. The one you're going to be most familiar with probably is a randomized control trial. That's fundamentally what most A/B tests are. And the important thing about a randomized control trial is it's hypothesis driven. You're going in with an idea. We think that this will make a better experience. We think if we increase the DPS of this gun, it will rebalance the game, and people will stay and play for more because it will be a more fun experience.
It has to be quantifiable.
Yeah.
That's super important here. It can't be the game is more fun unless you've defined the metric that is fun.
Yeah.
Otherwise, again, you're going to have a bad time.
Yeah. And again, I'd have a read up on the others. I won't go into them next, we're a bit tight on time, but fundamentally RCTs are the kind of, as I said, that's the gold standard of testing. But there are more advanced flavors, multi-arm and contextual banditing, and that's something which really I would say is kind of like the growing area in terms of testing now, which a lot of people are using. The difference is fundamentally from a randomized control trial is rather than randomly distributing players into treatments, you actually pick and segment your players and direct them to specific treatments. And the reason for that is you're looking to try and identify behaviors within users and match those behaviors to policies. So, an example would be, perhaps you put a red background on your store for Chinese players because red is a symbol for, for current making money in China, or perhaps it's a red, white, and blue one for American players. These are simple and not going to be massive elevators, I will say. But the point being, you are identifying and testing personalised treatments with the view that you can then roll out a personalisation policy that targets players based on what is the best experience for them, rather than the kind of the standard model where you test a few things and everyone gets the mean version of the game. You're giving out personalised versions of the experiences.
Yeah. So in terms of best practices on experimentation, define the objectives, define the hypothesis. Only test one thing at a time, asterisk, you can test multiple things. But to be clean and simple and more accurate, try to test one thing at a time. You're going to analyze, you're going to iterate, and you're going to adapt, and that cycle will go on throughout the entire life of the game. So if you're WoW and you are 19 years in, you've had a lot of time of iteration and adaptation. Sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't. I know people are pretty mad about some of the recent WoW changes, but I lapsed from it years ago, so I'm okay. And always maintain that control and feedback loop. So cracking on into personalization then, and Sean touched on this, but what personalization really is what we're trying to get to is an experience tailored to every player. So it's giving a better experience based on who you are and what you like. And my example here is always Final Fantasy XIV. They've got a massive quest system. It is very highly personalized to the type of play that you do. If you're a crafter, you are going to get crafting quests. If you are a PvP warrior, you are getting a lot of more PvP quests to do. So it's based on what you like to do. The most common way we do see personalization is in store treatments. And again, I think that's a little narrow-minded because that's just cataloging and merchandising. Doing this with actual game experience is a lot more fun.
Yeah.
So yeah, like we say, it increases the engagement, it gives personalized content, and it's all about the player. They've given us their time over and over. We are paying attention to what they like and trying to give them a game experience that really supports the way they like to play.
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of go through these quite quickly, but this is kind of just a loop that you want to probably take when thinking about testing and personalization. So kind of first, form a hypothesis. You're looking to answer a specific question. You have an idea about what's going to improve the game, so plan for that. Design and implement that test then. So you'll have an experiment running, or maybe many, but run that, obviously kind of see what your results are. At that point, you want to go into analysing the data. You're looking to validate, whether your hypothesis is correct. The technical term is a null hypothesis validation or a null hypothesis test. But fundamentally, you want to have a quantifiable metric as to what success looks like. Whether it's improved conversion rate, improved day 7 retention, improved session time, some way that you can clearly see this has improved, and we're able to measure that and quantify that and back that up with data. With that, and again looking at personalization, looking at contextual banditing, build out a set of policies that govern the types of experiences based on the types of players you see. So player group A, the collectors, they're going to get perhaps policy A, which gives them a certain subset of things off the store, whereas Group B are going to get, whatever their experience is. Build out and document and clearly state what those policies are.
The documentation is huge. No one ever does that.
Yeah, and then implement that derived policy for the players. Roll that out, and then the important one here is it starts all over again. You never end. Once you're done there, those policies might only be valid for a couple of weeks. Your player base might completely shift as new players onboard from other segments. Yep.
Cool.
Yep.
Yeah, I think we did the pillars earlier, so we can just kind of crack on through these. I think we can probably wrap it up. Just go to the last one and take it to global launch.
There we go.
So there we go. There was some great stuff there. You're all going to check out in the vault. Don't worry. But it was referencing what was at the beginning.
Yeah.
Important thing, global launch. It's not the end. You don't get to nip off to the pub now because you're building a long-term game. It's the beginning. Once you've released to everyone a normal Steam release, worldwide release, that's the beginning. We've actually started operating the game. So all that iceberg is still left to do. And this is, to me, this is the really fun part. There's going to be issues. You're going to get punched in the face. Someone is going to hack your game. Someone's going to have an exploit. Someone's going to make something horribly racist in the game and get shared among everyone. You need to be prepared for that. You do need plans and mitigations against it. You want your team set up for that so you can be building new content, responding to issues, and also building new features and game modes and things that we like as game developers. Avoid unnecessary updates because they cause churn, and plan for your updates in a calendar. And yeah, you're going to keep iterating on the actual backlog of what you're building. As you learn, you're going to iterate, and that's just going to happen over and over and over again. And if we did it really well, we'll be doing the same thing 5 years, 10 years down the line, and maybe even 20 years, like WoW, if it makes it there.
Yeah.
And that's us, so thank
you.
you. All right, and we've got a good 15 minutes for Q&A, so who's got some questions? Oh my God, so many questions.
I'm going to start off with like a negative one, but thank you so much. That was a really, really informative talk and really, really interesting. Do you have any advice on how to constructively kill a game? We've spoken about how to get from A to B. Did I miss that in the previous talk?
Both talks have had this question.
I'm sorry. Okay,
no, that's really good. Yes, I've done it a few times now because I'm a game killer. Sunsetting a game is a thing that you will have to do at some point. First off, I would say this is more for probably the biz dev folks, production folks in here, dev directors if there are any. At the contract stage, when we're working with a publisher, if it's not our own game, define the KPI that would trigger a game shutdown. Often that is the cost of a player, so the CPU, how much do we actually pay for a player to be on our servers playing our game? When that exceeds the kind of average value a user is bringing on a daily basis, that's normally the sunset trigger. Having a plan for this is key. Shutting down the monetization, offering refunds. Damien had a really good mention about making all of the store items, they were half price so everyone could get all the things they wanted for the last 6 months so everyone had a great experience. The biggest thing is communication though. Your community management's key, customer service is key, forums, Reddit, wikis, whatever we're doing for communication, this should be very, very present and you're going to communicate constantly because some players are going to be really upset that the thing they've spent years in is now going away. And hopefully you've got another game that you can kind of try to funnel them into.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, this is going to be smooth. We can just keep passing the mic back.
Go around,
Yeah, thank you. Good presentation. So data is one of these things that we've been keen to embed in a couple of our titles. But the thing that's put some hesitation in is the rules around data, and obviously the GDPR, and then there's the compliance rules with the SEC because of the Tencent thing. How's that being navigated?
Well, it's an interesting kind of point in terms of the data. The first thing to do is just not really take any personal data. We don't really need the personal data. Even when we had access to it years ago, I remember on I can't remember, was it GameSparks or something? It gave us the email address, it gave us the IP address, it gave us like
that was GameSparks.
Yeah. And but the reality is we never actually used it. So even though it provided it. So in terms of like GDPR, in terms of the California Data Protection Act, in terms of like the NSA stuff, First of all, just avoid it. You don't need it. It doesn't tell you anything useful about the player. You know, if you look at kind of, I suppose, traditional marketing and other types of like categorization or behavioral categorization, they'll look at things like, the 18 to 35 demographic, and those kind of classic things. None of them are relevant in games because none of it tells you anything useful or meaningful about the player. So all the stuff that would make someone identifiable is utterly useless to us. What we're interested in is what they do, how they play the game, and fundamentally there's no real alignment between that and anything that would make someone identifiable. So in terms of the ID, we don't take anything, and we shouldn't really, and legally can't, of course, take anything pertaining to anything that makes someone identifiable. The only thing we really want interested in is what they do, and at that point it's fully anonymized. And in terms of data pipelines, ideally what you have is you have that raw data coming in, but you actually aggregate that all up into groups of players and buckets, so then you end up with just a group of 10,000 players who are category A and 15,000 players that are category B. You don't need the data. Collect as little as possible in terms of identification and anonymize your data and group it up.
And pay attention to where your cloud hosting is, where you're actually storing and warehousing the data, because that is what can affect us on the SEC side, right?
Yeah.
If we're thinking about, anything that we've got going on, make sure that data is stored somewhere where that's GDPR compliant.
Yeah.
They've got policies to actually take care of any GDPR issues as well.
Yeah, like all cloud services like Amazon,
They're all-
you can choose where you deploy your data and your services. So you can obviously do region replication and pick US players get theirs in the US.
What
Yep.
tools are you using for data?
AWS. So we have a custom stack which we built in Leamington, which does our data. It's been built with kind of generalization in mind. The view there is all games fundamentally need the same thing. It's kind of every game reinvents the wheel. How many times has an entirely new data stack been put into a game when it's unnecessary?
And
they're all the same thing. You're getting player created, session start, session end. You purchase something, you did something. The gameplay stuff's obviously a little more granular, but actually 9/10 of the KPIs aren't driven by gameplay. They're driven by kind of front end, by purchases,
like
by
health
operation
metrics,
systems. Ideally, you build a system once and it's applicable to any game that you make in the future.
Standard events and standard payload across games just makes everyone's life easier. You add custom event types for the game-specific things Sean mentioned.
It also means as well you can standardize your reporting structures. If we write reports covering the DAO, the funnel, the kind of retention, write it for one game, it now works for every game. So again, it's just like taking that approach. We know we're going to do this for the next 5, 10, 20 games, so we might as well just make it so that it can work for the next 5, 10, 20 games.
Cheers. Awesome talk, very insightful. When you're talking about data, you mentioned having QA test the data. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Ooh, yeah. So I'm a proponent of this. I normally harp on about it. So ideally, when I'm saying QA is testing the data, they're actually checking the data that's coming in against what it should look like. So I do a race in Stampede. I should have a race start event, a race end event, and all of the pickups and things that happen in the middle. Those should be defined in a telemetry spec. And QA should be looking at that against an event log or an event viewer that's actually pulling it back in real time. And with the data processing we have now, they can also look at, say, a 5-minute ago report, make sure that things are lining up properly, that we are getting the right IDs, the right values for things, that you're not seeing something that's horribly out of bounds, like the range should be 0 to 10, and you're getting minus 2 billion, which is a number I think every gamer has seen. I would just make sure that they've got the setup to do that, and your data team will be using that setup as well to build that events pipeline. So keeping it standardized across the team, ideally everyone's got access to that data.
Yeah, I think actually the data democracy is something I'm kind of quite keen to have, and I don't see any reason why anyone on the team shouldn't be able to have access and kind of see what's happening in the game. One, it's the opportunity that avails itself there. Everyone, potentially can see an improvement, can make have an insight into what makes the game better. In terms of like the data, I think getting everyone access, and particularly with the QA side of things, I think as Laine said, it's kind of validating that the things are working, but also then you can ideally use it as a tool as well to help in terms of running automated testing, you can kind of if you know the events work, you can run a test and just use the events to help dictate certain things. Okay, the progression works. We can see all of those systems going through.
Actually, one of my prior companies, that's exactly what we did. So we basically had our own QA tool set just for analytics, and they were able to do automated testing back against the event structure, which was super helpful because this was a music learning app that had thousands of songs. So every update, you've got to test thousands of songs. No one wants to do that manually. No one can play that many songs on the guitar. It's really hard.
Hello. Thank you for the talk so far. It's very, very good. I have a question just as a statistician, as a data scientist really, is do you have any advice for when you're trying to bring forward a hypothesis, an experiment towards the rest of the design team, how to make sure that you're keeping it valid, that you're getting the aim of it at the end of it that you actually intended to get, rather than just deviating off left, right, and center, actually getting too much data that's non-interpretable anymore because you've gone off kilter? Do you have any advice for making sure that the documentation is precise and making sure that we are measuring what we're intending to measure, basically?
Yeah. I think it goes back to that kind of hypothesis valid. You go in with something you think is going to happen, and starting from that point, you could then start to lay out, well, what are the things that either validate or invalidate that? What informs, what are the levers that matter to that? If we look at that gameplay balancing as an example, changing the DPS, you can say, well, what are the levers then that are going to give us, the ability to validate this? Is it the session time? Is it the, number of matches per day? Is it kind of the equip rate of that weapon? Before you even go into the test, ideally, you can set out the full spec as to what you're testing, why you're testing it, and how you're going to validate it. And the important thing there is also to kind of have the scenarios planned out. What happens if you're right, and what happens if you're wrong? Because it won't always necessarily go out the way you think it will. So if you can think about all that up front, and this is where having a good product manager who can kind of own that and inform as well, utilize them. Product managers they're there to think about the product in this space, to think about the scenarios, think about how to kind of position things. They'll be able to help you kind of guide and think about what the levers are and what's important there.
Right, and strong data science as well, I think really does help. In terms of documentation, I had a great data team that would always provide us with Jupyter notebooks of every single experiment we ever did.
Yeah.
And it became massive, but it was so helpful. So helpful because they would update it with new data as it came in too.
Yeah.
So you could see as something became positive or negative once it was statistically significant.
Yeah.
And then you could read what the hypothesis was meant to do and how it should affect later downstream metrics. It was really nice.
Yeah, we had, when I was at Quali, we did multivariant testing, which is just fundamentally when you have usually you would only want to run one experiment on a time on a group. Multivariant testing is when you can have multiple experiments running, and the result is someone could be in 3 arms from 3 different experiments, and the idea is they become a multivariant group. So it became quite difficult to try and come up with these kind of specs, because you'd have I remember one we had 934 arms on a test because we had several experiments all running at once. But fundamentally, we still took the core experiments and said, what is it we think we're going to have? What's going to happen here? Where do we think it's going to improve? What metrics are important? There are specific tests. You can do a 2-tail test. You can do kind of null hypothesis validation. There are mechanisms in there, and speak to your data people. Data scientists are going to know far more than I'm going to know about this, about how you validate a hypothesis. Your product manager is going to know far more about how you kind of scope that in terms of the product and what's important. Your designers are going to really understand that. So it's the collaboration's important there as well. Get all the various parties involved. They're all going to have input and insights that's going to help just really firm up what it is you're trying to do and what you're trying to achieve.
Plug for our panel about Friends on the Front Line tomorrow at noon in Workroom 1, because we'll be going into the different LiveOps roles and how they work on a game team.
Yeah, very hungover panel.
No. We've been drinking water. We're responsible adults.
Yeah.
Cool. I think we've got time for exactly one more if we've got any more questions. Yes.
Hello. So I know that we probably all want to be the Wilds and the Final Fantasy XIVs of this world, and have tons and tons of people playing our game. But I mean, in a market that is, getting stretched more and more with so many live service games coming out, what does success look like for a moderate game for a timeline, and how far ahead do you plan when you launch a game?
This is such a great question.
Yeah.
This is a really good question. I don't know that there's a set answer to it. I always like to plan for success and also, or hope for success and plan for absolute failure, which means you've got to plan for the game team when nothing works out, and you can start pivoting the game and then eventually the game team. But realistically, you should be looking at least 18 months. 36 months is a really good barometer, but you don't need to go into detail on your planning and roadmap there because it will change already. And I think in terms of defining what that success looks like, that's up to the team. It might be as easy as we've made our money back, our development cost back on the game within 6 months. It might be that we've got a certain amount of players, or it might be that we've modeled this out and we know that by the end of year one, we want 20,000 active players per region. And that might be the metric that you're going for. But I think you do need to lead it from a business standpoint there. ROI is one that we used to use in mobile all the time. We would want to see the ROI on development and then ROI on ad spend, so ROAS.
Yeah.
We would want to see that ideally within a week. Normally it would stretch out to 21 days depending on the title. But we would really validate our health via methods like that.
Yeah, there's a whole area we've not covered because it's an entire beast in itself, which is like UA, which is predominantly what drives mobile kind of market and free-to-play games. And I think you said there, yeah, like ROAS is probably the most important one, the return on ad spend, which is your CPI or cost per install versus how much you make per player.
LTV.
But yeah, it's definitely something which probably could do with its own talk next year.
It could.
Yeah.
Where's our UI team? Where's our UA team in here?
Yeah.
We're going to volunteer them when they're not here.
Yeah.
Brilliant. And I think we have just cut.
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you all for the time.